over there and over the top. War the way men thought it would be. Romance survives the armistice on celluloid and pulp paper, in war movies, war songs, war stories. In the real war that ended in 1918, valor proved too often useless, plans too often meaningless against modern weapons. Among the writers of the disillusionment, there is a sense of war not as romance, but as tragedy. Among the artists, an image of men not as heroes, but as brutes and victims. Something has been lost, a post-war historian writes. Not a generation, but an atmosphere, a certain spirit. What has been lost is the confidence that once held a world together, a faith in the plans of reasonable men. A disruptive new force has been turned loose by the war. Bolshevism, the menace that hurried the peacemakers at Versailles. Revolution from the left, to be met by counter-revolution from the right. Writes Winston Churchill, looking back on the war years, injuries were wrought to the structure of human society, which a century will not efface. The new spirit, restless, violent, chaotic, is the heritage of war. On July 8, 1919, President Woodrow Wilson comes home from Versailles, home with a treaty that contains his vision of a post-war world. Peace, administered by a League of Nations. 8 weeks later, he is en route against doctors' advice on his cross-country campaign to sell the treaty to the people and force its approval by a hostile Republican Senate. Wilson faces a country confused in spirit. Wartime idealism is still strong, but so is the horror of getting involved in Europe's post-war chaos. In St. Louis, in Kansas City, in Omaha, in Los Angeles, Wilson tells Americans, the world has expected us to lead, and he warns against rejecting the treaty. I would like to get together the boys who fought in the war, and I would stand up before them and say, boys, I told you that this was a war against wars, but I am obliged to come to you in mortification and shame and say I have not been able to fulfill the promise. You are betrayed. Everywhere, Wilson meets cheering crowds, but an Omaha paper polls its readers and reports 9 out of 10 oppose membership in the League. And a New York paper calls it a trap of fictitious hopes. On September 25th in Colorado, depressed and tired after 40 speeches in 22 days, Wilson suffers a stroke that abruptly ends the tour. In November, as the president lies ill and partly paralyzed, the treaty goes before a Senate dominated by an opposition that trailed Wilson across the country, making anti-League speeches in his footsteps. Among the opposition, Senator Albert Fall of New Mexico, Frank Brandegee of Connecticut, William E. Borah of Idaho. California's Hiram Johnson says the choice is between the League and Americanism, and the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee calls the League that evil thing with the holy name. The chairman, Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts. On November 19, 1919, the Senate votes 53 to 38 against. The Treaty of Versailles, with its League of Nations, rejected by Democrats and Republicans, is returned to the White House. Woodrow Wilson, nursed and guarded by his wife, serves out his term as invalid and inactive president of a country trying to save itself from a world it considers unsafe. The fear of contamination is deepened by incidents at home, communist bomb plots and demonstrations. And the Justice Department, under an ambitious Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, exploits the fear. Social reformers, unions on strike, all protest causes are suspect as un-American. In 1 week of January 1920, 6,000 people are arrested, 250 rounded up for deportation, under wartime laws suspending civil rights. In 1920, Warren G. Harding, a Republican senator from Ohio who voted against the League, proclaims what he calls America's needs, not nostrums, but normalcy, not revolution, but restoration. That non-word, normalcy, becomes a slogan in his campaign for the presidency. It expresses the nation's nostalgia for a time that has vanished with the war. Without America, in 1920, the League of Nations assembles in a hall in Geneva, Switzerland. Statesmen now try to mend by negotiation what has been ruined by force, the sense of security on which the old world rested. Men who thought before 1914 that peace was permanent because it was so reasonable. Men now are haunted by memory and the fear expressed by Woodrow Wilson. Another world war within a generation. Trying to secure the future in Geneva and in other meeting places around the world, the old generation is still wrestling with the ghosts of its own recent past. Clemenceau of France is voted down by his own public as too lenient toward the Germans. Lloyd George's government will soon fall in Britain, its economy broken by the burdens of war. Winston Churchill, a leading member of Lloyd George's war cabinet, will lose his seat in Parliament.